I think I'll skip over the next. Obama's at it as well. This is his process for trying to prioritise evaluative effort on important social problems, and then to fund big-scale intervention trials, and then to scale up models from smaller trials to bigger trials. So again, it's a technique, I suppose, an approach for embedding field trials in the policy process. And then there's a slightly broader set of ideas floating around, which you see in New Zealand as well, for policymakers to set out more clearly what the mechanisms are that underline a particular policy before they commission evaluation, and to build sensible variation into policy so that experiments are actually inherent in the policy rather than seen as something you have to force into the policy. So trying to take advantage of either natural experiments or waiting time control groups or various other things in ways that don't necessarily do violence to the political intentions of the government, but which allow you to do much more interesting evaluations, and then to try and not move the goalposts during the evaluation if they can avoid it. So those sorts of ideas. And then these much more general ideas about the role of scientific advice to stop policymakers making spurious claims. So by placing policy and scientific advice much closer to the heart of government. And this is one example, the notion of principles of scientific advice to government. This was something that was developed, I think, primarily in the wake of a series of fiascos about policy on illegal drugs, where a series of scientific advisors flounced out of government, saying the government was ignoring their advice and why were they bothering. Now, setting aside the sort of prima donna-ish tendencies of certain academics, they had a point, which was that there was a lack of understanding, or there was a lack of clarity around what were the principles on which these people were giving their advice. So the idea is that government should respect and value academic freedom, otherwise what's the point of having advisors from experts from outside? Likewise, scientific advisors should understand where the democratic mandate takes ministers. It's nice in principle, much harder in practice. I'm going to go on to talk really about my views about some of these proposals. And this is where I got to my point of, am I really a nihilist? Am I throwing out the baby with the bathwater? Am I far too cynical and jaded? And are we in danger of losing a kind of a sort of latter-day version of an Enlightenment project? Because clearly we can't take these things holus bolus and say these are what a brilliant idea. I wonder why I had never thought of that. David Walker, who's a Guardian public policy editor, described most of these things as piety and naivety. So in relation to thinking about that demand side of the way that policy making takes place in a sort of Westminster-type system, that it requires some heroic assumptions about rational policy process run by fearless officials and politicians with high tolerance of uncertainty and a public with high levels of trust in government and a high understanding of randomised controlled trial design. So the test, adapt, and whatever it's called, that one about RCTs, operates in a world like this, where essentially the minister is a scientist. He's a disinterested, he's got a high tolerance of uncertainty, and he's just very happy to let the research take place. Because it's actually very rare to see explicit sort of upfront binding commitments made by politicians to use the findings of evaluation to take decisions down the track to stop or modify or continue a policy. In fact, in many ways, policy seems to represent almost the opposite of that. It is actually about, as they say, it is the mobilisation of bias. It's a decision. It's not an experiment in that sense. And there's certainly very little sign of a system that allows consideration for the role of evaluators in actually helping to make a policy suitable for evaluation. My unit spends a lot of time trying to get sufficient early intelligence about what's happening to be able to actually make that kind of contribution, and we really, really struggle. So the problem is that, in a sense, most of these proposals, particularly are more straightforward ones around, for example, the proposals around randomised controlled trials in policy making don't seem to me to offer very much counterweight to the sort of day-to-day pressures on ministers and officials, particularly in more adversarial political systems. And in fact, in we'd run a rather negative thought experiment, they could actually increase the demand for rather spurious or infeasible evaluations. So there's a vogue at the moment in the UK for seeing evaluation as a kind of reflex. It appears in policy documents, it appears at a rhetorical level, and then sometimes, to our horror, we actually get approached and asked to do them. And then you discover, of course, that what you thought you were being asked to do is not what you're being asked to do at all. It's unclear, really, in all of these, how researchers get informed or find out about these pre-policy activities. A lot of this depends on somehow a very clear and very easy and very early stage interaction between researchers and policymakers, which I'm not sure really can exist, or is certainly very, very difficult to organise. There's also then the question about, well, if you did become so closely integrated, would actually you be of any value in the future? You become entirely socialised by the department that you work very closely with. And maybe that's something that I'm in danger of. And then the concern that the people with the kind of public government and governance hat on talk about, that really the testing and criticism of policy ideas by outsiders could certainly have a very, very big impact on officials' relationships with ministers. That this is a very big cultural change. That's not to say it shouldn't happen, but it could, in other respects, have implications for good policy making. And that was the argument that the Department of Health used as to why it wasn't going to release the risk assessment that it had done for the Secretary of State for Health around the NHS reforms in England, that this was jeopardising the relationship and the integrity of the relationship between advisors and ministers. It didn't cut much ice in the media, that particular response. And since it's had such a lot of airing around the world, the nice for social policy idea, I think, needs sort of separate examination. I think it's important to think that remember that NICE is unusual in that it has this ability in certain respects for its guidance to be effectively mandatory, but it only applies to a very small number of technologies. So it is not making NHS policy. It's certainly not organising or making policy around the way the health system is structured, the incentives in the system, the payment arrangements and so on. It's not advising on things like hospital mergers or downsizing of services. And in fact, many of those aspects of policy that are not within NICE's remit can't so easily be reduced to a single set of value-for-money interventions. And I think there are some concerns in some of these areas about the extent to which, if it's certainly an argument that's been put forward about stifling innovation and creativity in policy making if you can only move forward on the basis of an independent agency's say-so around whether there's sufficient evidence to make a change. I think it's possible that the NICE type arrangements might work in niche areas of other areas of policy, although it's worth remembering that we've been starting to do some empirical studies about NICE and its mandatory guidance, and it is certainly the case that sometimes it's entirely ignored by clinicians. So this idea of an evidence-based organisation that has a decision right around what shall or shall not be funded within the NHS based on cost effectiveness is true up to a point. The more use of RCTs, I think simply because this paper has been, again, it's been very widely cited, although it's quite recent, and highly promoted by the Cabinet Office, deserves a bit of commentary. I mean, clearly, and I think the authors would themselves would probably recognise this, it can't be the solution for all policy analysis. It may be that it fits particular components or particular dimensions or aspects or subparts of policy that you can subject them to some kind of randomised trial. And I'm a great fan of RCTs. But we've seen recent examples of how difficult it is to sustain the sort of integrity of a trial and to give the researchers enough authority to actually follow through and decide if you set up a trial. We did one recently involving telecare and telehealth in the UK, which required a certain kind of patient to be randomised to receive the intervention or not. And despite a huge amount of planning of this trial and identifying suitable places in the country where it could be done, it was discovered in practice there weren't quite enough people of the type that was required, and the trial It was enormously difficult for the people delivering services to deliver enough patients, if you like, to the trial, and that led to a huge amount of ill will, which was not really the intention. The trial was supposed to be highly pragmatic, but in practice it turned into a bit of a straitjacket for people providing the services, and a whole lot of people involved rather sadly said, I will never get involved in a randomised controlled trial ever again, which seemed like a very sad outcome. And also, rather sadly, the results of the trial, although it's supposed to be the definitive largest RCT of using various assistive technologies, have been quite controversial and not clear-cut, sadly. There's also an assumption right through this sort of RCT paper and this whole set of proposals, which the clinical trialists are in a sense, arguing should be applied to wider social policy, and Ben Goldacre is a good example of that. His view on public policy is that we should basically take the clinical trial model and apply it to public policy, that basically health is right and all these other areas are wrong. But finding what the counterfactual is in some cases, I think, is extremely difficult. We're doing a study at the moment on something called the Public Health Responsibility Deal, which is a public-private voluntary partnership between government, NGOs and industry in areas of food, alcohol, recreation, number of other places, around basically moving forward with voluntary agreements and setting explicit, it's like a treaty really between a corporation and the government to say we will reduce the salt content of our burgers by a certain amount. The government's argument is that we've already got a plethora of regulation, and in a sense this is the next thing. We've got regulations in place, they function reasonably well, but if we want to make rapid progress in a complex environment where we've got the EU as well as a regulatory body, there sort of is no alternative. And now, although I don't completely buy into that, it's very unclear what the counterfactual for an evaluation of these public-private partnerships is in any straightforward way. So I don't know how you could possibly do an RCT, even of a subcomponent of this set of deals or relationships. Although the public health community is quite convinced that we should be trying to compare sort of statutory regulation with voluntary partnership agreements with a very clear view as to which they think is superior. There's also the explanatory problem that obviously you need to understand why something's going on in the way it is if you're going to change it. So the adaptation process can't just be driven by the outcome results of an RCT, and so on and so on. So there's lots and lots of, some perhaps rather detailed issues about why it's certainly not a panacea. And the bit that I think Haynes and colleagues make very light of, it's less than a page in the paper, is the adapt bit. The idea that it's a sort of a fairly straightforward process for a government to say, oh yeah, we were slightly wrong there, we're going to change our policy. As if that's just something that automatically falls out of the data in a competitive political environment. It's pretty heroic. And then I guess this is my final sort of point really of concern about many of these proposals, is that they tend to assume a rather sort of static world where there aren't contrary trends, and it's pretty obvious that there are a lot of things that make it even harder. Probably we haven't got a sort of fixed situation here for public policy making and better or higher value use of evaluation. Most obviously a whole lot of issues to do with the way that media attention and media pressure and sort of 24/7 news and the pressure on governments to be seen to be acting and intervening and doing things and being certain and being clear and being decisive push in a quite different direction from the sort of calm, considered view that we're going to compare alternatives using the best available scientific technique. Perhaps more short term, but you certainly see this a lot in the UK, is really what's happening to the capability and capacity of central government to actually work in this kind of way in a world where we've got, certainly at the moment, an imperative, financial imperative to downsize, but also there's an increasing ideological imperative that basically wants to get central government out of policy making, which sits rather uneasily around. So we've got this rather bizarre situation, the Cabinet Office, where Francis Maude is the minister. Francis Maude seems to basically want to shrink central government to the point that it's like a dot on an old TV screen. At the same time, the Cabinet Office is producing a whole series of papers about this sort of randomised controlled trial dream of how policy should be made, and you're thinking, well, who's organising